everybody, it's Emily at ARG Schooling, and today I kind of wanted to have a chatty video about how I came to be a horror fan. This is a thing I've thought about a lot lately as my youngest daughter has started getting into horror. She's 12, almost 13, and so I've been kind of contemplating like why I enjoy horror and how I came to this fandom, not really fandom, how I came to enjoy it. So we're gonna have to go back. We're gonna have to go way back. So I started, my first encounters with horror is when I was probably around 6 years old, maybe a little bit younger, but somewhere between 5 and 6. And I would wake up in the night and wander into the living room where my father was watching TV, and I would just sit with him. And he was usually watching a horror movie, and I would just like plop down on the couch beside him, and he didn't send me away, as he probably should have. And so that was my introduction to Freddy Krueger, when I was way too young to know the difference between real and fiction. And so for years, I had nightmares where I was convinced that Freddy was going to get me if I went to bed alone. So I slept in my brother's room, on his floor. He's younger than me. My logic makes no sense, but I slept in my brother's room on his floor for a good 3 or 4 years, thinking that there was safety in numbers. I stopped when he got sick one night, stood up and vomited on me, and I decided maybe this was not safer. And by that point, I had decided that maybe Freddy wasn't real. So as a kid, my brother and I both really enjoyed watching scary movies. It was one of those things that, like, my dad didn't really think about whether things were appropriate or not. It was just sort of, yeah, I like watching this, so let's watch it together. And so we watched a ton of stuff. I watched all the slashers I could get my hands on at Blockbuster. We watched all sorts of weird things, Leprechaun, what is that one with the things that come out of the toilet? Ghoulies or something like that? I don't even know. Critters. We watched so much stuff. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like, some of the movies were terrible, some were really fun, and we got to a point where Freddy Krueger really became my favorite thing. Nightmare on Elm Street to this day is like my favorite of the slasher franchises. I watch it almost every single year. We used to, as kids, we used to have Nightmare on Elm Street marathons where we'd invite our friends over and we would just binge the whole thing through. I remember how exciting it was when the 6th movie came out, and like, it was the first time I got to see a Nightmare on Elm Street movie in the theaters, and it was 3D. It was so exciting. so like that was my introduction to horror as like a visual thing. It was probably around the age of 11 or so, maybe 10. I think I was probably about 10 years old when I discovered that there was horror books. I'd always been a reader. I've always loved reading. So when I was around, I don't know, I must have been 10 or so, I discovered Christopher Pike. And I started reading Christopher Pike books. This is my favorite Christopher Pike, but I read a bunch of them. This is Remember Me, which was a trilogy, but I only ever read the first one, and I was obsessed with it. And I remember giving my copy to a friend to read because I wanted someone to talk to about my favorite book, and I never got it back. So recently I was able to get a copy, but that was sort of my introduction to the fact that you could read horror too. I'd only ever seen it on like movies and stuff, so this was the first time I realized you could read it too. Also around that age is when I first started really learning about the Holocaust. I've always been a morbid kid. Like, I was always that weird kid who liked to talk about death and watch scary movies and think about different ways to die and all that sort of weird stuff that most people don't expect to come out of a small child. But that was just how I was. And I was probably around 11 or so when I really started learning. I mean, as a Jew, I feel like from birth we know about the Holocaust. That's a thing that's just ingrained in us from a young age, and like, I remember my mother talking about it frequently as this thing that happened to us, always to us, not just to like our ancestors. This is the thing to happen to us. And people in our family died in this terrible way. And I remember picking this book up once. I don't know where I got it. I must have gotten it from the library because I didn't own a copy. And this was the first time I read a book that wasn't specifically horror, but was horrifying. And this was like my deep dive, if you will, into the Holocaust and learning about this horrific event. And I wouldn't say this is horror, but it kind of is in a way, because it's a real thing that happened. And reading about the fact that people were gassed to death and their bodies were burned in these giant ovens and in mass, and it was just, it's awful. And this book in particular is really pretty horrifying to read when you're 11. So I would say this, I would count this as part of my journey into horror, because that made me realize, like, well, one, I've always been kind of obsessed with learning about the Holocaust. It's always been sort of my thing. But it also made me realize that there's kinds of horror that I like and kinds that I don't like. I've always preferred horror that felt supernatural in some way, because then I'm safe, because that can't really happen to me. I've never been a fan of things where it feels like this could really happen. I don't like that as much. I feel, it makes me feel unsafe. So I've sort of gravitated towards horror that feels make-believe. So on my journey into that sort of thing, I wanted to start reading more adult fare. I felt like I was too old at the tender age of 11. I was too old for baby stuff. I didn't want to read Goosebumps or anything by R.L. Stine, because that felt like it was written for kids, and I was not a kid. I was too mature. So that's when I discovered John Saul. And John Saul became a favorite author when I was young. I bought to reread. I haven't for a long time. I've been meaning to pick up some of his books so I could reread and see if I still like it. Like, I reread Remember Me fairly recently. I have a vlog I'll link if you guys want to check that out, where I reread that just to kind of see, like, do I still enjoy this? And I want to do the same thing with John Saul, so you should stay tuned for that. It's probably going to happen sometime relatively soon, because I have a whole bunch of John Saul books I want to get to. But this was my introduction into the more mature realm of horror. His books were probably would be closer classified to young adult if I had to do that, because they almost all, at least all the ones I read, they nearly all involved a teenage protagonist. This one in particular was my favorite, and it's about a kid who is like a genius, and he's recruited to go to this school for children like him, and something nefarious is happening. And I remember just being obsessed with this. Like, I always liked the idea of, like, kids who were geniuses and like going to a boarding school and things of that nature. So this was like right up my alley anyway. But this was like so intriguing to me, this type of horror, that I wanted more of that. So I read every John Saul I could get my hands on between the ages of like 11 and probably 20. I think that, like, by the time I was 20, I was kind of moving on to other things. When I was around 12, 13 or so, I decided I was ready for some really, really awful stuff. Like, I wanted the worst books I could find. And I remember in middle school, I was probably in the 8th grade, maybe the 7th grade, I don't know. 7th or 8th grade. I found a copy of The Exorcist at a yard sale. This was a book that I had heard of. I've seen the movie, I think, around that age, and was sort of let down by it, because I was like prepared for something so much worse. I feel like that movie was way overhyped. Maybe it was really scary for the time it was made, but by the time I got to it around the age of like 12, it felt tame almost. And so I found the book at a yard sale, and the book is way worse than the movie. Like, it's really messed up. And I brought it to school, and I was showing my friends different passages, and we were like passing it back and forth, and I got in trouble. my teacher, I don't remember what teacher specifically, but my teacher was really concerned that I was reading such things. And, you know, being the only Jew in a very, like, Christian town, they were already worried about my soul. So, like, this was a concern. Like, should you be reading this? I honestly don't remember if they contacted my parents. I feel like if they did, my mother probably didn't care, because she let me kind of read whatever, and my dad is the one that, like, got me into this stuff in the first place, so I don't think that anyone would have, like, been concerned besides my teachers. So, like, I started reading stuff like that. And that's how I stumbled onto Stephen King. Like, I knew of Stephen King because I think I'd seen Pet Sematary, and I remember reading Carrie first. Carrie was like my first Stephen King. And this is the book, though, that I would say made me a Stephen King fan. I read it when I was around 13. And I was either 12 or 13. I feel like I was probably 13, though, because I'm pretty sure I read Carrie first, and that was when I was around 12. And so by the time I was 13, I was, like, ready for this. And I loved this book. This book kind of blew my mind, because not only is it enormous, and I read it because I was one of those kids that was like, I'm so mature, and I can read, like, giant books, and aren't I the smartest? So I was kind of a brat, but I loved this because this book was so, in my mind, so intricate and so detailed, and, like, I'd never read anything like it before. Stephen King created this world that he didn't just make us like a time capsule of it. He made the whole time, like all the time, for this place. Like, this goes back and back and back in time to, like, so you can see, like, how Pennywise, or this creature, had been, like, terrorizing Derry since the beginning, and, like, it goes back and back and back, and, like, the whole idea of it was just so massive to my childlike brain that I just, like, could not imagine anyone having all of that in their head and then writing it down. Like, I've read this book so many times since then, and I've always loved it. It still holds up for me. After that, of course, I had to read every Stephen King I could get my hands on, and so I would check out books at the library, and, like, anytime I found a Stephen King book, I would have to read it. And so I didn't read everything he's ever written. Like, there's still many books by Stephen King that I haven't gotten to, but I read a good chunk of his writing. Some of it amazing, like It and The Stand, that I still think are, like, peak literature, and some that was not great. But I thoroughly enjoyed reading all of it. And so now I'm an adult. Now by now in my journey of horror, I have reached adulthood. And I don't have too many more books here to talk about, but I did want to talk about a few of my, like, more current favorites. All of these I feel like I've talked about before, so this is nothing new if you've been following me for a while. But being a fan of Stephen King, the minute I discovered Joe Hill, I was obsessed. Like, I needed to read his books. Like, I was like, oh my god, what is a person raised by Stephen King going to write about? And the first book I picked up by Joe Hill was Horns, and it is still my favorite Joe Hill. This book is really weird and very disturbing, but so good. Like, the story is great. See, for me, for horror to really work, I need a good story. I need characters that I love and care about, that I want to see come out on top in the end. And so a book like this is just, it's horrible yet beautiful. In this story, we're following Ignatius Parrish, and he has been mourning the loss of his girlfriend, and it's now a year after her death, and everyone blames him. They think he did it, but there's never been enough proof to, like, convict him of her murder. But he knows he didn't do it, and he's always tried to figure out who did. And so this story starts where he wakes up on the anniversary of her death with horns. And these horns give him power over people. He can make them do the things that they like want to do but would never, because, you know, you're kind of like your worst desires. And so throughout the course of the story, he's using that power while he's searching for the person who really did kill his girlfriend. And it's really messed up. It's really dark. This is probably one of the darkest things I've ever read, considering that I've read The Exorcist. And it's so good. Like, I love this story. And I've read just about everything Joe Hill has written since then. My favorite after that is Lock and Key. Those are graphic novels, and they're amazing. There's an adaptation now. The second season starts tonight. I'm super excited for that. But the comics are one of those like incredible, intricate, beautiful stories where like there's so many different like things going on, but you fall in love with these characters and you're rooting for them and you want things to happen for them. But it's also really dark and scary. I have two other books I want to get to. One really isn't horror but feels like horror, and one is like another favorite horror. I'm going to start with the one that isn't really horror but feels like horror, and that's Unwind by Neal Shusterman. The whole concept of this series, I feel, is quite horrific. And while this isn't technically a horror novel, I feel like it could be categorized as such because the ideas in it are pretty terrible. You have this new America in which there's been this war, the Heartland Wars, fought over reproductive rights. And to kind of come to a compromise, abortion is now completely illegal, but it is completely legal to choose to have your 12 to 17-year-old unwound, which means that we have the ability at this point in time to not need medicine anymore because you can cure anything and everything with parts of teenagers. So you can, like, you have bad eyesight? Let's get you some eyeballs from a teenager with good eyesight. Do you have a brain tumor? Let's replace your brain or parts of your brain with that of a healthy teenager, and so forth and so on. You break your arm? Here's a new arm. And so these children are being taken to these centers where they are unwound. And this story follows kids who have escaped this fate. But there's a particular scene in this book that is actually the worst thing I've ever read. I have a fear of hospitals. I have a fear of being operated on. Like, the whole concept of, like, being unconscious and unable to do anything about it while someone is inside my body, like, is very, very scary. I'm getting ready to have oral surgery on Monday, and I'm kind of terrified, but I'm gonna be okay. But it's fairly minor, but I'm gonna be asleep while they do it. And the idea of somebody in the scene that this happens, the child is awake and aware because they need to keep them awake and aware, because if you unwind someone, technically they don't die. They're still alive. All of their body parts are harvested and kept alive to be used. So technically they're not dead, which is awful. And so you're there with this person while their body is being taken apart piece by piece, and the nurse is talking to them and keeping them alert and aware. It's seriously the most terrifying thing I've ever read. I have to plug my newest favorite author, Grady Hendrix. And of course my favorite Grady Hendrix is My Best Friend's Exorcism. I feel like this is his best book. And that might just be my opinion, but it's my opinion. I think I've enjoyed all of his books, but this one in particular is still my absolute favorite of the things that I've read. This is set in the 80s. It follows teenage girls, and it's sort of is his take on a Mean Girls situation, except what if that mean girl was actually possessed by a demon? It is really great, and I like that all the chapter titles are like song lyrics. Are they song lyrics or are they songs? I think they might be song titles. Yeah, Total Eclipse of the Heart, Broken Wings. So, like, they're all song titles, and that's just great. I love the 80s and anything to do with the 80s. That's like my favorite horror time period, I think, too. Like, of course there's Scream and stuff like that came out in the 90s, and I absolutely love that too. I've read other great horror, like Stephen Graham Jones is a new favorite. I don't have anything to show because my copy of My Heart is a Chainsaw is downstairs, but I've read The Only Good Indians, which I thought was really good. The Night of the Mannequins. The Night of the Mannequins is like my favorite Stephen Graham Jones right now, which I've only read 2. But I absolutely love that. That's like my favorite kind of horror, I think, where you've got teenagers and an unreliable narrator, and you don't really know what the hell is going on, but you know something really messed up is happening here, and you're sort of unraveling the story as you go. I love that. That's just great. I'm currently reading White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson, which is, again, kind of that same concept of, you know, this is a messed up situation this teenage girl is in, but you don't know quite what's happening, and you don't know if she's reliable or not because she's had some sort of mental breakdown and she's recovering from that, and you don't know what that breakdown was about, but you're figuring it out as you go. Love that. That is like my favorite kind of horror, I think. So that's like my journey to horror, my journey over the years of like immersing myself in this genre. I feel still like a noob. Like I don't know. There's a lot of things I haven't seen. There's a lot of books that I feel like I should have read if I want to actually call myself a horror fan. I've hesitated to make this video because while I love horror and where I feel like I should be able to say that I'm a fan of horror, there's so many things that I haven't read yet that I'm like, can I really say that I'm a horror fan if I haven't read this huge list of things? And the answer to that is yes, I am a horror fan. I do love to read and watch horror, and I don't know why I would hesitate to say that, because I love dark, spooky things. Like, I decorate my house year-round with things like pictures from Derry, Maine, and skulls, and, like, I'm a horror fan, even if I haven't read everything, even if I haven't seen everything. So tell me in the comments, what is your favorite scary movie? What is your favorite scary book? My favorite scary movie, because I didn't even talk about movies that much besides like when I was growing up, but my current favorite scary movie to this day is Cabin in the Woods. It's the best horror movie I've ever seen. It's a great story. The twist is mind-blowing, and I still love it so much. I watch it every year. I'm actually probably going to watch it tonight because I haven't seen it yet this year because I don't have anyone to watch it with right now. My husband likes vampire stuff, but he's not really a big horror fan like I am. So I tend to like only watch stuff when my kids are home, and they're not right now, so I have no one to watch with. But I think I'm going to watch it tonight anyway because I love it. So tell me in the comments, what's your favorite scary movie? What's your favorite scary book? And I'd love to hear about it. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time. Happy reading. Bye.